This is BBC North on 2. Now, the start of a new 5-part series in which poet Pete Morgan sets out on the grain run, a voyage to the north.
Hello, welcome on board the Terence G. My name's Pete Morgan and this is the start of the grain run, Britain's ancient water highway. We always think of the Romans travelling by road, never imagine them travelling by water. But the grain run follows the Roman route, follows the way they carried the grain up to their garrisons in the north. Right now we're in the Wash, just off the coast of Lincolnshire, and this is the start of our voyage. We're going to travel from here to the most northerly point it's possible to reach on England's connected waterway network.
On our voyage, we'll be looking at life and history along the way, but we start by taking a closer look at the Wash. There's more to see than its flat, empty surface might suggest. Today, these waters are not so busy as they used to be in Roman times, but you still find craft like the Terence G, a typical Lincolnshire cockle boat. She's under the charge of her skipper, John Lynham, hand on tiller. The Lynham family have survived on the pickings of the Wash for the last 200 years or so. Britain has been called the best known piece of geography on Earth. In fact, the Wash is a blank space on the map. It's blank because it's ever-changing. Every tide which ebbs and floods makes its mark beneath us and around us. It's on the ebb that the drab sandbanks with the exotic names poke dully through the water. Hook Hill, Herring Hill, Black Boy Sand. And it's on the ebb that the Wash begins to throb with life. But today, John Lynham and his mate Alan Pordham are seeking a smaller catch, smaller by far than the huge grey seals the size of cattle basking on the strand. In practice, it's not so easy as it sounds. You have to find where the cockles lie. The breathing holes are the giveaway. But it's not worth raking out a single cockle. You want them by the bucketful.
It's thicker here.
Yes, is that good, that?
That's better. 2 empty shells.
There are a lot there, aren't there?
Stories of the cockle fishing are legion, like the one about the man who caught his weight in cockles, but found he couldn't lift his catch, and he watched his boat drifting away from him onto a far horizon. Traditionally, the day's harvest is always prepared fresh, cooked on the sea where the catch was made, while waiting for the tide to flood, or else on the way back into port.
And you actually cook them in here, do you?
That is cooking them. That's cooking them.
It's a good soupy smell, actually, isn't it?
Very good.
Come out quite easy then.
Oh, yes, come out well.
Are they ready to eat now?
No, they've got to be washed yet. No, there'll be a bit of sand. There'll be a bit of sand in them. A little bit of sand in them. Not a lot.
Yeah, how do you get that out?
Wash them.
Oh.
In a washing machine.
There's a certain art in Alan Pordham's skill with the washing ring. 10 deft turns through a rising tide, and not a single morsel missing. Thanks to archaeological research, we know that the Romans in Britain shared our taste in shellfish. At the time of the grain run, the wash was awash with oyster beds. But at that time, the wash wasn't quite like this.
The scenery of the grain run has shifted considerably since the Roman occupation of Britain. And if the Romans were to come back now, they wouldn't know the place. We're heading into the haven, the sheltered mouth of the River Witham. And in Roman times, this cut between the high green banks on either side wouldn't have been here at all. In Roman times, all this was open sea.
The mapping of ancient coastlines is a risky business, and it's doubtful whether a definitive coastline can be interpreted at any precise period in history. But we know for certain that the distant port of Boston was once the gateway to the Wash, and we presume that just 300 years ago, the land stopped here. The granite memorial is a clue to Boston's special place in history. These days, it's a 7-mile journey up the haven and into Boston. The day's catch is cooled and ready for the pallet before we get there.
Would you like one of these?
I'd like to try them. I think one first, yes. Oh, lovely.
Should be. They just come out of sand, don't they?
But they're a mellow taste, aren't
You'll
they?
never get them any fresher. I'll try them.
Actually, they are a very mellow taste. Sometimes you get them a bit sharp, don't you? Is that...
That's the vinegar and the acid and that they keep them in nowadays. But them straight out the sand, you see, they're fresh, aren't they?
Yeah. Are they good for you?
They're supposed to be good for your sex life, but I don't know. Nobody's proved it.
At one time, Boston was the premier port of England. In the 13th century, her docks and quays yielded up more customs dues than even those of the Port of London. Today, it's a tiny fraction. It's in Boston that we say goodbye to the Terence G.
Right, thanks, John. Cheers.
Despite all the 20th century redevelopment, there's still a lot of the old town left, and it's well worth looking at. Some of the redevelopment preserves the exterior. A former grain warehouse becomes a music centre. Blackfriars, the 13th century Dominican priory, is now a theatre. Fidel House remains one of the finest 18th century houses in England. The Guildhall is now a museum. This fine building of Dutch brick was built in 1450.
It wasn't until 150 years later that Boston Guildhall really passed into contemporary history. It was in 1630 that a group who sought religious freedom attempted to leave England. They were arrested in Boston, brought to this courtroom, where they were detained and led down here. These steps lead to the cells where the group who later became known as the Pilgrim Fathers were incarcerated. It's amazing to think that 7 men were kept in 2 cells the size of this one while awaiting their trial at Lincoln Assizes.
The hustle and bustle of contemporary life make it difficult to imagine that Boston's most famous landmark predates the Pilgrim Fathers. Standing at the west end of St. Botolph's, the largest parish church in England, is the best place from which to appreciate the great height of the Boston Stump. The keystone, reputed to weigh some 6 tons, is 137 feet above the floor, a height only exceeded by the vault above the span in Liverpool Cathedral. The Boston Stump is one of the finest medieval lantern towers in England. The view from the summit repays the climb. South past that granite memorial marking the place where the pilgrims were first arrested. North, our way ahead, the way the Romans carried the grain. That was before the Boston Grand Sluice, built to terminate the tide and help control the flood. When the Witham was in flood, it was apparently impossible to tell where the Witham was. It looked more like a lake than a river. Previous high water marks are recorded on the base of the Boston Stump.
This is the Sarah Whitby, our craft for the next 40 miles or so from here on till the River Trent. But of course, we haven't finished with Boston yet. There's a lot more to see here by water than you might think. And the Sarah Whitby is an ideal vessel for this purpose. Her skipper's Alan Thompson. Good morning, Alan.
Good morning, Pete. Come aboard.
Thank you.
Best step live today because the tide's going out.
Oh, right.
With the help of our crew, Nicky and Tony, we cast off and head north through the sluice while we're on the tide. The efficiency of the Boston Grand Sluice belies its age. This intricate locking system first opened over 200 years ago. Over the centuries, the operating mechanism has been modernized, automated, but the principle remains the same. Gravity does the work. What's particularly interesting about the Boston Sluice is that unlike most tidal locks, the sea gates, doors as they call them locally, have to be used at every tide. Twice a day, the doors close automatically to keep the rising water out. Once we're through the second set of doors, we're safe, protected by the sluice behind us.
You won't find too many locks on the grain run, but this one at Anton's Gout takes us off the natural watercourse and onto an intricate system of man-made waterways. They weren't designed so much for the passage of boats as for land reclamation and the prevention of flood.
Their rather unromantic name suggests their use. Through that gate behind me are the Witham navigable drains. You don't get powered assistance through the lock at Anton's Gout. From now on, you're very much on your own. The word drain conjures up visions of murk and polluted water, but in fact this lock is the gateway to a remarkable 59-mile network of irrigation channels. There was a time when Witham navigable drains were used for the carriage of agricultural cargo, but since the coming of the petrol engine, all that stopped. The Witham drains bring us face to face with the Roman connection. Strange as it may seem, it was the Romans who initiated land reclamation in Lincolnshire. But it isn't Rome that comes to mind when you examine the low-lying country on either bank.
When you come to negotiate the Witham navigable drains, you really get to see why they used to call this part of Lincolnshire Little Holland. Of course, that was the colloquial name, but the Dutch influence was recorded officially as well. Until the local government reorganisation, this part of Lincolnshire was known as the Holland Division.
The similarity is more than merely accident. When the English called on the continental experience of land reclamation 300 years ago, it was the Dutch drainage engineers who initiated the intricate system we find today.
Hello! All right.
The Witham drains look at Boston through its back door, but the atmosphere of Little Holland is never very far away. To the north of Boston, on the outskirts of the village of Sibsey, stands Trader Mill with its 6 white sails, or sweeps as they call them hereabouts. Trader Mill preserves the heritage of the Lincolnshire Fens. Everything's in perfect working order. Despite the unflappability of the swans, there's a fair wind blowing on the drains today. By the time we get back to the River Witham, the same fair wind is blowing there.
Drop it behind the light box.
A good opportunity for us to return to that more primitive source of power.
Can you cast that off, please? Slack off the main sheet.
Right, slacked.
Ready? Yeah. Ready about. Here we go.
Does that look good?
Got the engine.
And that's it. Now it's gone quiet and peaceful. We're back under the same power that they always had in the olden days. All they had was wind and tide.
We're all used to the concept of Roman roads. Before the Roman conquest, there were no roads in the modern sense in Britain at all. But we're less used to the concept of Roman waterways. That, however, is what the Witham became. Bread was the staple of the Roman world, and the basis of a soldier's diet was grain. The Witham became a means of transporting that requirement up to the garrisons in the north.
Thanks to the initiative of our Roman invaders and the things they taught us, this area of Britain is now one of the most productive agricultural areas in Europe. You can put three adjectives to this land. It's flat, it's alluvial, and it's reclaimed. Its major crop is still, you guessed it, grain. Eric Dring has farmed this area of Lincolnshire for the last 40 years. Eric. Hello. Thanks very much for bringing a cargo for us to take on our rerun of the grain run. Is this as a result of your own crop?
It is indeed. Exactly what was grown in the area last year, and I can say that it is a very fine sample of Lincolnshire grown wheat.
Lovely.
Of course, the Romans didn't find vast flat fields when they arrived in Britain. But it was the constant preoccupation of every garrison commander to see that his troops had sufficient in store to see them through the winter. Thanks to the Romans' almost psychopathic dread of the open sea, this is the route they chose to ship the grain. Not all of it from Lincolnshire, but from East Anglia, across the Wash and up the Witham. There isn't a hill in sight for miles on this length of the river, but we're approaching the low-lying Chapel Hill, where that stretch of water known as the Kyme O links the Witham with the Sleaford Canal.
It seems to have become something of a tradition to carry a folding bike when you navigate on England's inland waterways. It's a good thing, too. It gives you the chance to explore. There was a time when you used to be able to visit the Roman settlement of Sleaford by water, but then they closed the Sleaford Canal, or rather, they let it go.
During that period in history when water was the prime means of transport, the town of Sleaford was important enough to have its own canal. With the coming of the railway, water ceased to have priority, and gradually the Sleaford Canal declined. It was closed to traffic in 1878. Now they've cascaded the locks, turned them into waterfalls. Today, the Sleaford Canal Basin bears little hint of former glory. Now it takes a pair of wheels to follow the old canal the 12 miles from the Witham into Sleaford. Now, in the 1980s, the Witham too has lost her commercial traffic, but strangely she hasn't lost her commercial importance. It's thanks entirely to her intricate web of drains and dikes that the Lincolnshire Fens remain flood-free and irrigated. The River Witham is still a vital cog in the local economy. The first leg of our voyage to the north has navigated the first line in the defence of the Fens against the sea.
The flatness of the land through which the grain run passes might have certain disadvantages as far as land drainage is concerned, but it does have certain advantages. There isn't a lock for miles. Join us again when we travel the River Witham up to Lincoln, once the most important Roman settlement on the grain run, Britain's ancient water highway. See you then.
And Pete Morgan continues the grain run at 8 o'clock next Friday.
This autumn, BBC Two presents Tender is the Night, Scott Fitzgerald's classic love story set in Switzerland and on the French Riviera.
Dear, it's upstairs. I came upon a scene which...
It's inadvisable to comment on what goes on in this house.
Tender is the Night, this autumn on BBC Two.
This is BBC North on 2. Continuing his journey on Lincolnshire's waterways, poet Pete Morgan sets out from the Fens on the second leg of the grain run, a voyage to the north.
Hello and welcome back on the Grain Run, Britain's ancient water highway. My name's Pete Morgan and I'm on board the Sarah Whitby heading up the River Witham. We're following the Roman route, following the way they carried the grain from the Fens of Lincolnshire up to the north. We have our own symbolic cargo.
The huge Roman barges which plied this water also carried pottery, beef and hides, occasional imported luxuries from Rome, but grain was the basis of the Roman soldiers' diet, and grain was the major cargo. The Sarah Whitby is 23 feet from stem to stern. The hand on the tiller belongs to our skipper, Alan Thompson. We're carrying a crew of two, Tony Martin and Nicky Keyworth.
Take off the ties.
These days, the river beneath us has changed her character. The last commercial traffic has given way to pleasure craft, but she hasn't lost her previous importance. In the 17th century, Dutch drainage engineers used the Witham to dry the fens. They dug their drains, then built embankments to keep the water off the land. It didn't quite work as planned.
As the fens began to dry, so the peat began to shrink, making the fenland lower than the water in the rivers. The only solution was to pump that water from the land into the drains, back to the rivers, and hopefully out to the open sea. That's Dogdyke Pumping Station.
The prospect of Dogdyke was once sufficiently impressive to inspire the occasional watercolourist. Today, the squat red brick building still houses one of the earliest steam engines used in Fenland drainage. Thanks to a preservation trust, the original engine is still in operation over 100 years after she was first fired, first steamed up. Today, all this has been surpassed. Now it's electric power which drives the pumping stations needed to keep the fenlands dry. But the Dogdyke beam engine is a remarkable example of 19th century engineering achievement. Built by Bradley and Craven of Wakefield in 1855, her 16 horsepower is geared through a scoop wheel at just 7 revolutions in a minute. Those 7 revolutions are capable of shifting 25 tons of water in 60 seconds. By the 1930s, steam had given way to diesel. The fact that both sources of power still work, if wanted, is a tribute to their generation. Of course, the earliest source of power used on the Witham wasn't electric, diesel, steam. The earliest pumping engines were powered by the wind, simple windmills which drove a wheel to lift the water. And wind was the power source used by the Romans to haul their barges up the Witham from the Wash. That's the power we use today as we tack across the eye. There's one obvious hazard ahead on the grain run which wouldn't have been known to earlier navigators. In Roman times, it's certain that the majority of wider rivers were crossed by fords or else by ferries. Nothing to impede our progress there.
That right, to the side? Yeah, that's it, thank you. She's clear. And it holds them.
But just as they brought the roads to Britain, so they introduced the bridges. Although no bridge of Roman times survives intact, enough fragments have been found to prove that they were skilled bridge builders. The bridge that leads to Tattershall came a long time after the Romans.
Thanks, Alan. The habit of taking a folding bike when you navigate on England's inland waterways seems to have become something of a tradition. It's certainly useful, particularly in a landscape like this, where the only hills are up the banks of the Witham. From here, it's just a mile, 1 flat mile, to Tattershall Castle.
The first castle at Tattershall was built of stone, but by the time Ralph Lord Cromwell came to rebuild the fortress, gunpowder had been invented. No need for stone now. Might as well build in local brick. The flamboyant fashion of the 15th century was changed by the building of Tattershall. Cromwell could allow himself ground floor entrances, larger windows to let in light.
It's well worth climbing the 181 steps to the top of the southwest turret just to see the view from the top. On a good day, they reckon you can see Boston Stump and Lincoln Cathedral from up here. I don't know about that. The two of them are 30 miles apart, and you'd certainly need good eyes. But up here, there's something you can't miss.
One advantage of the low-lying landscape through which the grain run passes has always been defensive. flat land is easy to dominate. The defender can see the invader approaching. The military advantage still applies just as it did in Roman times, just as it did in the 15th century, just as it did in World War II. This area of Lincolnshire has played host to the Royal Air Force since 1940. Woodhall Spa became the home of the Lancaster bombers of 617 Squadron RAF. It's as well to remember that RAF life at Woodhall wasn't all a matter of doom and gloom. In the event, 617 Squadron became better known by their nickname than by their official title. The Petwood Hotel was once the officers' mess of the Dam Busters.
The 50-acre grounds still boast a rusted memento of the Second World War. This unlikely-looking object was once the shell casing of that remarkable invention of Dr. Barnes Wallis, the bouncing bomb.
Chances are that Dr. Wallis' robust invention would have been better preserved had it bounced in the waters of the River Witham. Over 1,000 years ago, that fate befell the Witham Shield, one of the most spectacular prehistoric finds ever recorded in Britain. Other trophies from the Witham have included swords, spears, hairpins, candlesticks. It's strange that some of England's most impressive pieces of metalwork should have been found in one of her least known rivers. But today the weed-fringed banks of the Witham belie the river's ancient importance. This was the major Roman supply route across Lincolnshire. These were the waters used by the Vikings when they invaded Britain. Thanks to the protective qualities of the silt on the bed of the river, many of the ancient relics dropped in the water were found to survive in better condition than those which stood upon her banks. All that survives the gaunt remains of Kirkstead Abbey is the tiny church of St Leonard, the 13th century chapel built in memory of Robert de Tattershall, the original founder of Tattershall Castle. St Leonard's was built for travellers, and thanks to the fact that it stood outside the abbey walls, the tiny church was able to survive the centuries of vandalism which followed the dissolution of the monasteries. At Tupholme Abbey, they took the stone to build the farm. During the Middle Ages, the Witham Valley housed some of the most influential monastic houses in Britain. But now there are haunting reminders of a far more recent past where the ghost line of the Great Northern Railway follows the line of the river. It was this line which linked the port of Boston with the national rail network and ended the river's commercial traffic. When they closed the railway, the valley was briefly silenced. Nowadays, thanks to the roar of the low-flying jets, there's cause for complaint at Southbury's local inn. There might be the occasional roar from the skies above the Witham, but the banks of the river are comparatively quiet. It's thanks to agriculture that the river has avoided industry so successfully. At Bartney, the two come briefly together at the beet sugar factory, the fruit and vegetable cannery, but it's not too long before we bid farewell to that. Providing we don't bear off down one of the huge drains feeding into the Witham, we should be close to Bartney Lock, the only lock between the port of Boston and the city of Lincoln. Between the 2 points, the fall in the river is just 16 feet. 16 feet in 30 miles. After miles of flat, bracing scenery, to work the lock and agitate the placid waters of the Witham is something of a relief. As we pass Fiskerton, the old fisher's town, we're just 6 miles from the city of Lincoln. Now, for the first time, the distant towers of Cathedral City can be seen on the horizon.
When this was the grain run, the waters of the Witham would have been a good deal busier than they are today. Same with the waters of the Cardyke. That small channel across on the southern bank was once the great Roman canal that linked the River Witham with the River Nene in Peterborough.
The original use of the Cardyke is open to argument. Some historians believe it was built for trade, others that its use was purely land reclamation. But believe it or not, that tiny cut links together all the fenland drains and delphs, and it's just as vital now as it was in Roman times. Fill in the Cardyke and we'd lose an eighth of Lincolnshire, all of it under water. Once we're past the Cardyke, we're within sight of the Norman Cathedral on the hill. In Roman times, this was one of only 4 settlements in Britain to be afforded the title Colonia. Lindum Colonia became Lincoln, Lincoln. It's Stamp End Lock that cuts off the weedy fenland water from the city centre waterway. The Romans began the work of fenland drainage, but over the centuries we've carried it on. Now this final stretch of the Witham is more a navigation than a river. And truly, Stamp End cuts the water off. This lock is unusual for this part of the world. It works à la guillotine. The guillotine of Stamp End Lock divides far more than one stretch of water from the other. It cuts between the work of nature and the hand of man. Despite such 20th century necessities as parking bays and bottle banks, multiple stores and gents' urinals, this final stretch of the Witham is one of the best preserved stretches of urban waterway in Britain.
This has got to be one of the finest sights on the grain run, probably one of the finest sights on the waterways of the world. This is the Glory Hole, one of the oldest bridges in England, built in medieval times on the foundations of a Norman bridge. What makes the Glory Hole unique is the four-storey block of timbered buildings perching on the western side. When we passed through the bridge, the middle of the bridge was just 9'9" above the water. It's difficult to imagine that Lincoln's High Street passed above our heads.
If you were driving through Lincoln, you could miss the Glory Hole. It's only from the water that you can fully appreciate the great Norman arch, the 16th century houses. It's only from the water that you can fully appreciate the sudden impact of Brayford Pool. Indeed, if you were driving, you might not even notice this great expanse of water which, because of development by our Roman invaders, made Lincoln into an inland port. Today, we're welcomed on the Brayford Pool by disinterested swans. Somehow it seems appropriate, for this is the bird traditionally associated with St. Hugh, the saint who rebuilt the great cathedral on the hill after the first church was shattered by an earthquake. When I explore, I tend to seek out the ancient rather more than the modern, that which can no longer be seen rather than that which is here to be seen in abundance. Perhaps that's something to do with earning my living as a poet. Lincoln Cathedral looks impressive enough now, but what must it have looked like when each of its towers was crowned with a spire? We know that the tip of the central tower brought the cathedral's height to a staggering 500 feet.
Somehow it wouldn't seem right for a minor poet to visit the city of Lincoln without paying homage to a more successful practitioner of the craft, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Poet Laureate from 1850 until his death in 1892. No other laureate has ever achieved Tennyson's commercial success.
Alfred Lord Tennyson was born in Lincolnshire, and he would be aware of much of the Lincoln we see today. Certainly he would know of the Bailgate, the main north-south road through the city, where a line of granite setts marks the position of a row of Roman columns. Once these rough-hewn mosaics were the front pillars of a Roman public building. Carry on up the Bailgate, following the line of Ermine Street, and you find Newport Arch, the Roman gateway. This is the way the Romans came, through the gate and down the hill. This is the way the Romans came, and if you listen, you'll hear them still. Roads were important to the Romans, but as far as the carriage of goods was concerned, the focal point of Roman Lincoln was the water. It was water which carried what they needed most.
Thanks to nature, it was simple enough for the Romans to get the grain from the Fens right to the heart of Lincoln. All they did was they shipped it up the Witham and into the Brayford Pool. But they wanted to get it further north. They wanted it in York. The Roman solution was to build a canal. And this is it, the Fosdyke, cut by the Romans in AD 120 to link the Witham with the Trent.
Of course, the banks of the Fosdyke have changed considerably since Roman times, but this remains the earliest man-made waterway in this country, still in navigable condition. The canal age in Britain didn't dawn until over 1,000 years later. The earliest navigators couldn't afford to hang about. Their cargo was expected to arrive on time, and when they left Lindum Colonia, they left the defences of the town. From now on, they were passing through a landscape in which the traveller was unprotected. Not for them the luxury of intermittent stopping places.
Fend is over, please.
Right.
Don't mind the fend off.
I'm fascinated by waterside pubs in general, but particularly fascinated by the Pyewipe Inn. Despite its apparent proximity to Lincoln, the Pyewipe is one of England's more isolated waterside inns.
You're all right for it, Alan.
The place preserves the language. If it wasn't for this pub, I would never have known that Pyewipe is the local name for the peewit.
Leave that to you then, Nicky.
Right, thanks, Pete.
Perhaps I preserve the language too. The peewit is the lapwing.
But perhaps the Pyewipe is best known because the local folktale is that it was here that most famous of all Lincolnshire men, the Lincolnshire poacher, was finally apprehended one moonlit night on the banks of the Fosdyke.
In the days of the Lincolnshire poacher, this long straight cut to the north was alive with traffic. Even the banks were well worn where the rope scythed through the weed between the barge and the horse which hauled it. In the poacher's time, the Fosdyke was of prime importance. Not only grain, but wool. Wool out, coal in. Today, its use is entirely pleasure craft. The final decline in the fortunes of the Fosdyke came in the 19th century when the power of the horse gave way to the train. The Great Northern Railway leased the canal for 800 and something years. The railway brought a quicker form of travel. They sold cheap seats on the trains. On the next leg of our voyage to the north, we'll be boarding a more powerful craft when we're back on tidal water. Join us there.
Hello, my name's Pete Morgan and I'm your guide on the grain run. We're following Britain's ancient water highway, the way the Romans carried the grain north from the Fens of Lincolnshire. Right now we're in the Fosdyke, the oldest canal in Britain that's still in navigable condition. When you look at it now, it's difficult to imagine that this waterway was cut by the Romans in AD 120. We're 23 feet from stem to stern. It's reckoned that some of the great Roman barges which used to ply this water measured over 100 feet, 4 times the length of our craft, the Sarah Whitby.
When the Romans carried their grain on their grain run, just as we're doing today, they were not so fortunate. There were no civilian settlements on the banks of the Fosdyke. The village of Saxelby is one of the most unusual features of canal architecture. You could literally step off the boat into the high street with its shops and inns. Usually it was the practice to build a town facing away from the water so the canal passed behind it. Here they built the village to face the towpath. The Fosdyke has had its ups and downs since Roman times. There's no way of knowing how busy it was when first it was cut, but we do know that it had declined badly by the later Middle Ages when the banks were clogged with rush and weed. But by the 18th century, the cut was cleaned and clear again, thanks to intervention by the Crown, and in 1840 it reached its commercial peak, over £14,000 in tolls. Now its use is purely pleasure.
All the way. Steady as she goes. Keep going at that. Steady, not too hard.
Under the Jolly Roger, our skipper, Alan Thompson, has guided us across Lincolnshire on our voyage to the north. Now we hoist the mainmast for the final time. The Fosdyke isn't a long canal, 11¼ miles from the city of Lincoln to Torksey Lock. The first lock went in here in the 17th century, but it's possible that some form of gate system divided the quiet, man-made waterway from the more turbulent tidal water, even in Roman times. Now there's a thriving little community with its pub, its moorings, and its helpful welcome from the British Waterways lockkeeper.
Hello. Is that all grand? Good weather too, isn't it?
Yeah, just the job today.
Thank you.
It's at Torksey Lock that I test my footing on dry land.
Lovely. Got it. Thank you. Alan, thanks very much. That was a great show, mate.
Have a good journey.
Thank you.
Been very pleasant.
Having left the Sarah Whitby at her moorings, there's time for me to bike it into the village of Torksey before I hitch my next lift to the north. Torksey owes its one-time importance entirely to its position at the junction of the Fosdyke and the River Trent. But this area of Lincolnshire was also known for its exquisite pottery. Today you could pay a small fortune for anything decorated by William Billingsley, one of the finest craftsmen of the locality. But 1,800 years before Billingsley's time, pottery was already well established here. During the Roman occupation, pots of all shapes and sizes became the secondary cargo on the grain run. Hundreds, thousands of fragments of Romano-British pottery were found where the Fosdyke cuts into the Trent.
Once we've passed through Torksey Lock, we're back on tidal waters for the first time since we left Boston 45 miles ago. The Whittaker's tanker, Humber Dawn, is an impressive vessel. She's 149 feet from stem to stern, 2 main engines, 300 horsepower, and when loaded, she's capable of carrying 470 tons of bulk liquid. It'd take 20 road tankers to shift that lot between them.
The Trent is an impressive river. Navigable for almost 100 miles, she's the third largest of England's rivers, after the Thames and the Severn. In the middle of the river, we travel the geographical boundary between Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire. We travel the dividing line between the present and the past. On the Lincolnshire bank, the ancient ruin of Torksey Castle guards the site where the Vikings wintered after they followed the route of the grain run and invaded up the Fosdyke. Now the gaping Tudor facade of the Torksey ruin gives way to the electric pulse beat of the 1980s. Unlike the Fosdyke, the Trent still supports commercial traffic, but over the years her trade has varied. Grain, gravel, wool, woad, you name it, the Trent has probably carried it. But in the 1720s, when Daniel Defoe completed his tour of Britain, the largest cargo was cheese. 4,000 tons a year of it, up the Trent and into the Humber. Today, the major cargo is oil, thanks to the need for power. There are so many power stations on the banks that this is known as Kilowatt Valley. They say that so much warm water is pumped back into the river, it'll never freeze again. It's hard to think that it ever froze before.
The methods of transport might have changed since the Romans began the grain run, but they've left their marks on the banks of the river, and they've left their marks beneath us. Here at Marton, the Roman causeway comes down on the north bank of the river, passes beneath us, and then comes up on the other side. It wasn't until the drought of 1933 that we found that ford was paved with stone.
The Roman causeway is the only way across the Trent between Marton and Littleborough, but the road is still called Littleborough Lane. If you want to cross to the tiny Norman church without getting wet feet, it's 14 miles by the nearest bridge. On a typical run, the Humber Dawn delivers bulk oil to one of the depots on the Trent. Our skipper, Freddie Watts, does the trip regularly.
Are there any difficulties in navigation on the Trent?
At times there is, shall we say summertime, when the water's very thin, you know, down to its minimum of 5 feet sometimes.
Yeah.
So you almost have to be in the channel. There's problems in various places, Pete. For instance, you will see today that on certain corners are very acute, going back on yourself. And a ship of this size, it just is possible just
to make it,
you know, without being that acute. Otherwise, it's not a bad river at all to navigate, really.
No.
Yeah, I prefer it myself to the River Ouse.
You do?
I do, definitely, yes. Oh, yes.
In the 19th century, when water transport had reached its peak in Britain, the legal requirement for a crew was 3 men and a boy. Now it's two, the first mate and the engineer. In those days, it was always the practice to carry one cargo out and another cargo in. But the need for power has changed all that. Today, the returns on one bulk cargo are sufficient, enough to make it a one-way carriage beneath William Weston's Trent Road Bridge. The height of the central arch of Weston's 18th century bridge governs what goes up and down. We know the Romans carried their grain in sacks, but today bulk carriage has also moved in on the grain run, and 65,000 tons a year pass through Gainsborough, bound for Belgium, Holland, Germany. Now grain takes up a third of the annual cargo past the 18th and 19th century wharves and warehouses of one of England's most inland ports.
Ian Nairn, the architectural critic, has described these wharves as one of the most interesting waterfronts in the country. Nairn's statement proves the man has an eye for detail. Gainsborough's history and its charm are hardly reflected in its present-day appearance. But thankfully, some parts of the old town survived the Industrial Revolution. It's worth a closer look.
If you keep your eyes open, you still find a few of the features from George Eliot's time. This is the town she disguised as St. Ogg's in Mill on the Floss. Unfortunately, that particular building didn't survive, but thankfully the town's grandest piece of architecture did, the Old Hall in Parnell Street. The unexpected appearance of this black and white manor house slap in the middle of the town centre comes as something of a shock.
Originally, the Old Hall was built in the 15th century as a residence. Since then, it's been a soup kitchen, a theatre, a public house, a dance hall, more predictably, a corn exchange. But perhaps the Old Hall's greatest claim to fame is that this is where Henry VIII, fat and middle-aged and lonely, first met Catherine Parr. Catherine became his sixth wife.
On the night they met, Henry and Catherine would have sat to enjoy this kind of fare. This magnificent 15th century kitchen has been described as one of the finest and least spoiled of the few medieval kitchens remaining in this country. But all of this was very much below stairs. It's a pretty safe bet that none of this magnificence would have been seen by the Old Hall's more illustrious visitors.
Neither could those visitors have dreamt the new soup bubbling on the banks of the Trent. This is the age of oil, and this is the home of the land-based oil well, England's mini Dallas, where the begging eye of the praying mantis pumps us back to the present. It's not known how the Roman navigators passed their time when they were on the grain run. Certainly gambling was the most popular activity, perhaps a game of dice or two. In those days, the Romans were alone. No riverside communities, no Saxelbys, and no West Stockwiths.
Looking at West Stockwith today, it's difficult to imagine that this small community was once a busy inland port, but it was, thanks largely to the work of James Brindley, the 18th century canal architect, who wanted to get the lead and coal out of Derbyshire and onto the path of the grain run.
That canal cost more than Brindley estimated, took longer than he calculated, and he didn't live to see the lock gates open in 1777. But they open for us today, a brief diversion up the Chesterfield Canal. The last commercial traffic stopped in the 1950s, and now, like so many other canals, the Chesterfield is just for pleasure. But the success of Brindley's dream child wasn't short-lived. 80 years after his death, his canal was still averaging 500 tons of lead and coal a day, 200,000 in the year. Now, the atmosphere has changed. After the tideway of the Trent, this narrow canal, which picks its way between the hedgerows, comes as a safe surprise. The River Trent is a far more effective barrier than the narrow cut of the canal. At one time, the smaller settlements were connected by ferries, but since the coming of the motor car, they've gone, though a few of the ferry houses survive almost intact. Now there's virtually no communication between one bank of the river and the other. 50 yards across the water is 10 miles round by road. The total lack of communication between the east bank and the west enhances the sense of remoteness. So too does the increasing turbulence of the water. But once this stretch of the river was even more remote.
The land behind me is the Isle of Axholme. During the Roman occupation of Britain, the higher land was forest, the low levels were marsh and swamp. But it really was an island, 20,000 acres of land bounded on all sides by tidal water.
The island made a perfect natural fortress. Even now, 2,000 years after the Roman occupation, it can prove rather difficult to find a handy landing place.
Right. Right, thanks, Ron. Car.
Originally, the Isle of Axholme was occupied by the Corytani, the ancient inhabitants of Lincolnshire, who continually raided the passing Romans from their island fortress. The vengeance of Rome was to sack the Corytani and burn the forests. But the biggest change in the Isle of Axholme didn't come until the 17th century, when Cornelius Vermuyden, the Dutch engineer, began the drainage scheme which ultimately increased the size of the island from 20 to 80,000 acres. 80,000 acres of easy riding. But it wasn't an island anymore. It's probable, though it can't be proven, that the settlement which gave its name to the one-time island is Haxey, where the River Idle lapped the southern shores in the days before Vermuyden's drainage scheme. Now the inhabitants of the Isle of Axholme belong to Humberside, and they're called Islonians. Interestingly, they retain a ritual from the days when Axholme was an island in more than just its name.
It's from here, from the Lady Mowbray Stone, that each year on January 6th, the Haxey Hood is thrown into the air. And as the hood is thrown, the Lord sings out, house against house, town against town. If you meet a man, knock him down.
The genesis of the ceremony of the Haxey Hood is obscure, but it's believed that this rugby-like melee could be pre-Roman in its origins. It's possible that the remoteness of the Isle of Axholme led to the survival of a druidic ritual in which the hood or head is rucked and scrummaged from one end of town to the other. House against house, town against town. If thou meets a man, knock him down. It's extraordinary that a ritual which could be pre-Christian survives in such close proximity to Epworth, where St Andrew's Church stands apart from the village. Today, Epworth is the centre of a religious pilgrimage from across the world. It seems the village is changing its face to cater for its visitors. In the main, Epworth owes its fame to one name. Almost 300 years ago, Samuel Wesley came to Epworth as rector of St Andrews. The family home still stands on Albion Hill.
My own personal interest in the Wesleys isn't confined to the males of the species, but to the woman who ran the rectory. Susanna Wesley not only gave birth to 19 children, but she organised those children's education to such an extent that one of them became the founder of one of the world's great religions.
John Wesley, the seventh of Susanna's children, the founding father of the Methodist Church. At the time of the Wesleys, power wasn't known on the River Trent, and this exhilarating surge with its 5-knot tide flow was thought to be far more dangerous than it's known to be today. Thanks to radio communication, we're not alone. We do have contact with the outside world, but that's a gift which is sometimes interrupted. It's just when the river begins to broaden that we lay low the radio mast with its company flag and head on north beneath the newest bridge to cross the Trent. Time was when we showed a pride in our bridges by giving them proper names, not just letters, numbers. But this bridge carries the M180, and this is the M180 bridge. Perhaps it would be a misnomer to christen a construction of dull blocks of concrete, something like the Princess of Wales. Just to the north of the Scunthorpe skyline is our second bridge in spitting distance. As far as engineering is concerned, it's more original than its neighbour, and it does have royal connections.
The George V Bridge at Keadby was the only swing bridge to cross the Trent. Here both road and rail crossed the river on one huge arc. Apparently the bridge was known to stick, and in the 1950s it became something of attraction. People used to drive from miles around to watch 4,000 tons of bascule span stuck up in the air.
The George V swing bridge hasn't swung for 30 years, but it's still a useful navigational aid. From here on northwards, the water gets more difficult. For anything but the most seaworthy craft, the swing bridge effectively marks the end of the Trent. It marks the end for me, for the moment.
Cheerio, Freddie.
Cheerio, Frida. Been very nice having you.
Thanks.
Cheerio.
Look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah, ta-da.
Ta-ra. Cheers.
Cheerio.
For the Humber Dawn, there's 300 horsepower beneath the hatch to see her off for a very different cargo from that which the Trent once carried when Emperor Hadrian built his wall.
Grain from the Fens, all the way to York. A journey of over 100 miles with only the wind and the tide for power. It makes you wonder how the Romans did it. On the next leg of the grain run, we're going to sample the ancient method. We'll be travelling under sail on the Humber sloop, the Amy House. Don't forget to join us, will you? See you then. Hello and welcome. I'm Pete Morgan. On the last 3 legs of our voyage, we've followed the grain run, followed the way the Romans took to carry the grain from south to north. But so far on our journey, we've taken the easy way. We've used power where the Romans relied on nature. All they had was wind and tide. Now, it's the same with us for a while.
We're on board the Humber sloop, the Amy House, and we're carrying our token cargo, grain from the Fens of Lincolnshire. We're under the charge of Cyril Harrison, ex-Royal Navy, now an honorary sailing master with the Humber Keel and Sloop Preservation Society. And the waters beneath us, those of the Trent, the 3rd largest of England's rivers. For years, the Humber sloop was a familiar sight with her fore and aft rig, her huge black lee boards which grip the water when she has to work to windward. It seems to be calm enough today, no need to shelter from wind or rain. On days like this, the performance of the Amy House takes on an almost balletic quality. Although her delicate manoeuvres might at times possess an aesthetic quality approaching art, the backdrop of the river's industry doesn't always match up to it. But then the existence of the Humber sloop was entirely due to the needs of industry, and over the centuries, grain and coal became her bread and butter.
Fortunately, the traditional tan mainsail of the Amy Howson does tend to relieve the monotony of the landscape. The lower reaches of the Trent tend to become eerily atmospheric, nowhere more so than at Flixborough, where a village named a tragedy.
After the Flixborough disaster, the sculptor David Norris chose the symbol of mallards returning to peaceful waters as the Flixborough Memorial to commemorate that terrible day in 1974 when 27 people lost their lives. Today, the Flixborough Memorial has gone. That was stolen 10 years after the disaster, but the chemical plant of Nipro UK still haunts the landscape, although it's no longer operational. Remember the ancient English saying, "Wherever grain will ripen, hope will sweetly bloom." Back on the Trent, there's a sweet wind blowing. The Amy Howson has gathered a fair speed, and for the first time on this voyage, we've got the lee boards down. It's something of a lesson in itself to stand in the stern beside our skipper and watch.
Let go.
And listen as he coaxes the Amy Howson.
Come on down, officials.
How's she handling, Cyril?
She's handling real well today. There's a fairly stiff breeze, and turning these narrow waters, you've got to be a bit careful.
Yeah.
Because on the falling water, you'll have to run aground.
How long have you been working them?
Well, I went first when I bought these in 1936, and went out of them just before the war, went into the Navy. I came back into them when they started re-rigging this, because there was only motor ships when I came back out of the Navy.
Cyril's cajolements are firm but somehow delicate.
Come on, gal, come on, come on, come on, come on. There ain't much water. Let go, Dave.
Of course, she's an unpredictable river, the Trent, as well, isn't she?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Well, how do you rate this? I mean, what's she like today?
She's going good today. Been kind to us.
I soon learnt that Cyril Harrison is a master of the understatement. I stood beside him, so cold I could hardly speak, and Cyril described the Trent as kind. It seemed to take an eternity for the Amy Howson to wend her way north toward our first stopping point.
Pass it over the top.
The shores of the Trent are dotted with wharfs and quays too small to be known by any but the most experienced navigator. These days, the sight of sail is something of a rarity. In Roman times, there were no waterside hostelries, and the first boatmen who plied the grain run couldn't pause to slake their thirst in the nearest town or village. All of this came a great deal later.
1939 was the year of my birth. It was also the year that they built the brand new ferry house here at Burton-on-Stather. The new building can't have done much for trade because it was in that year that the last ferry plied across the river to the Garthorpe side.
But the 1939-45 war brought a stranger to Burton-on-Stather. The waters of the Trent were right for him. Dr. Barnes-Wallace's main interest in the reed-fringed banks of the River Trent had little to do with the qualities of the environment. Here, the current channels, the speed of the tide, and the width of the river were a fair match for a different river in a different part of the world. Here, Dr. Barnes-Wallace and the members of the Royal Engineers Water Assault Wing's special inventions practiced for the Rhine crossing at the end of the Second World War. Although the Water Assault Wing stayed at Burton-upon-Stather throughout the war, Dr. Barnes-Wallace's stay was fairly short. But it has been claimed that more secret gadgets were tried and tested here than anywhere else in Britain. Today, there's little evidence of the sapper's occupation. The concrete ramp from bank to river, the skeletal relic of something sinister, only seen when the water's shallow. In fact, the evolution of the Humber sloop is due to the shallow water through which she had to travel. The Humber ship owners needed to load the maximum possible cargo in the shortest possible hull. A return to the measurements used by the Romans.
The River Trent disappears here at Trent Falls in the confluence of three rivers. The Ouse and the Trent join together to become the Humber, and that river flows on east toward the North Sea, what we used to call the German Ocean.
We turn left up the Yorkshire Ouse across Trent Falls. There's something of a misnomer. There are no falls. At low water you can measure the depth in inches, but at high water it can be a savage tide race.
After you've travelled for mile upon mile under power, it's good to get back on board the Amy Howson and travel under sail. All you can hear is the slap of the water against the hull, the creak of the rigging. But round about here, there's another sound, the call of the wild from across the water.
The Blacktoft Sands Nature Reserve is 460 acres of tidal reed swamp fringed by salt marsh, one of the largest expanses of reed swamp in England. 12 years ago, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds leased this site from the British Transport Docks Board. Since that date, some 200 species of bird have been recorded. Over 40 species have nested. But it isn't only bird life that's made its home on Blacktoft Sands. The Romans themselves regarded it as a delicacy, but according to Caesar, the ancient Britons refused to eat it, regarding the hare as a magic beast.
Let go.
Despite today's apparent tranquility, you couldn't call the Ouse a predictable river. The banks are low. Here the landscape does not protect the water. All there seems to be is sky. "60 feet from stem to stern, 15 feet across the beam, the Amy Howson is a typical example of the smaller coastal and estuary craft common in Britain for at least 500 years. Long after sail had given way to power, the Humber sloop continued to survive. Certainly the Amy Howson was a well-known craft on this water into the 1950s. The Humber sloop had to be multi-purpose, seaworthy for coastal work and yet easily manoeuvrable for rivers and canals. The sloop fulfilled her dual roles perfectly. Coamings and hatchboards gave the cargo protection against the elements, salt and rain. Under Cyril Harrison's expert charge, her ease of handling made the voyage north to our next port of call as easy running as the river.
The name Goole is hardly romantic, but in fact, this town is one of my favourite ports on the northern waterways of England. Until 1822, when the Air and Calder Navigation Company chose this as the terminus of their new canal, Goole was a hamlet with 2 or 3 farms, some labourers' cottages and 1 or 2 inns. Within 3 years, its population had trebled.
When the canal age was at its peak, the port of Goole was the terminal point for sail. Here, many of the craft like the Amy Howson unshipped their masts and continued horse-drawn up the canal. Goole remains a terminal point today. This is the most inland seaport on the east coast of Britain. What I find most appealing about this bustling little town is the way the sea rubs shoulders with the land. We may be 60 miles inland, but you still catch the tang of salt and wind. It's not unusual to turn your car off the main road and find a ship at the end of the street. Now the massive gates of Ocean Lock in Goole become our terminal point for sail. It's here that we leave the Amy Howson and return to power. The British Waterway's motorised barge, the Maureen Eva, is longer than a cricket pitch. Beneath the hatch is a single 150 horsepower engine. The tide that runs up the Yorkshire Ouse is one of the strongest on any English river, up to 9 knots at times, but unlike the Romans, we can run against it. From here on northwards, the river narrows and the banks of the Ouse get busier. Despite her spick-and-span paintwork, the Maureen Eva is approaching her 25th birthday, a quarter of a century. She's old enough to retain the traditional woodwork in the wheelhouse, the elegant polished brass. Usually Len Tennyson's cargo is steel and chrome. Today, it's the bike, the sack of grain, and me. The number of bridges on the Ouse would hinder the progress of any vessel under sail. Either the bridge must open or the vessel must lower its mast. The Romans were the first to bridge the Ouse, but it was the opening of the Goole Railway Bridge in the 19th century which scored a point for the railways in the war against river transport. Here the bridge is 830 feet across with a giant 250-foot swinging span. Despite the gargantuan proportions, the hydraulic system can swing the 700 tons in under 60 seconds. But the coming of the railway didn't kill the river. In 1905, the Ouse achieved the greatest tonnage ever carried since records first began. A half of it was grain. These days, most of that cargo travels by road across the country, avoiding the tidal mudflats and the island hazards of the Ouse. In the 20th century, there are no architectural problems with powered bridges across the river. Now, in the age of the motorway, the giant arc of the M62 road bridge climbs from one bank to the other, leaving an adequate clearance of air between the concrete and the water. Apart from the stark grey underside of the M62, the view from this stretch of the river has been the same for centuries. For almost 500 years, man has been able to stand on the deck of his sloop or his barge and catch a sight of Howden Minster rising through the trees. By contrast, the river's traffic has changed. Now the little shifter is one of the few vessels to work the Ouse, newsprint, on its way to York.
When the Booth Ferry Bridge was opened, the Goole Times published a booklet to commemorate the occasion. Price 6p. Quite expensive for 1929. The bridge doesn't look much to write home about, but when it was opened, it knocked 20 miles off the road to Hull, and it cut the journey from the south bank of the Ouse to Howden from 20 miles to 3.5.
Good lad.
See you later, John.
In fact, the Booth Ferry Bridge was no commercial advantage to Howden in 1929. The town lost its through traffic, and it also lost its local trade. But it did save the town from the ravages of later redevelopment. Why so large a church in so small a market town? The 135-foot lantern tower was built with a £40 legacy from the will of Bishop Skirlaw in the 15th century. And why the magnificent chapter house, roofless for 300 years? The answer is that Howden was once the capital of Howden Shire, a vast administrative province governed by the Prince Bishops of Durham.
Howden has a much more recent history than its purely ecclesiastical past. It was during the 1920s that this Minster town saw one of the most significant experiments in aviation history. That experiment was the development of the R-100 airship, built to the designs of the remarkable Barnes Wallis.
Unfortunately for the learned doctor, the airship on which he worked at Howden Airfield was only a half of the British government's airship development programme. While the R-100 proved herself, even crossing the Atlantic, the other half of the experiment did not. And after the crash of the R-101 in northern France, the British airship programme was abandoned. The R-100 was massive. In height alone, just inches shorter than the lantern tower of Howden Minster. Howden Minster, built to celebrate the power of God. Today we build to celebrate the God of power. North of Howden, the river boxes the compass through bends called bights by the local navigators, and the newcomer is constantly surprised to see the same tall chimney appearing, reappearing, but never seeming to get much closer. In Bishop Skirlaw's time in the 15th century, the height of Howden Minster must have seemed phenomenal, probably insurmountable, but now there's Drax. At 850 feet, one of the tallest chimneys in Europe. In Skirlaw's time, wind was the arbiter of speed, and there were no restrictions on the Ouse apart from the right to fish the water. In his day, the church held the fishing rights to 30 miles of riverbank either side of Howden. Now you have to watch your speed for fear of washing the banks away. You have to watch your speed all the time as the river narrows, and with a vessel the size of the Maureen Eva, it's customary to turn about before you get to Selby. Once you've turned, you run astern, and that improves the maneuverability, past the shipyard where the vessels have to be launched sideways. Even if you travel backwards, to approach Selby by water is undoubtedly the best way to arrive. The Abbey came by water too. All the way from Monk Fryston Quarry, over 8 miles away. No wonder it took 100 years, and that was just to build the nave. After the Abbey, Selby's most famous landmark has to be the bridge. It doesn't look much, and it's not. To motorists, it's probably the most notorious, most infamous bottleneck in Britain. It's privately rewarding to achieve the Selby Toll Bridge experience from the other side of the tracks, sliding backwards, gently through without the flush of bemused frustration, fingers drumming on the steering wheel. At one time, the Selby Toll Bridge was manually operated, an even greater bottleneck then than now. Now hydraulics do the work. For almost 200 years, since the Selby Bridge Act of 1791, there's been a concession to local drivers and all pedestrians. It's visitors and vehicles who pay their way. 5p a tonne to cross the bridge above the waters of the present-day grain run.
Of course, none of this would be known to the Romans. At the time they ran their grain run, these shores would be thick with forest, and there wasn't one bridge across the Ouse. There weren't any towns either. The concept of townships was brought by the Romans, just as they brought the roads to Britain, just as they cut the first canal. On the final leg of our voyage, we'll be boarding different craft as the river narrows. Don't forget to join us, will you? See you then. Hello and welcome on the final leg of the grain run, Britain's ancient water highway. During the course of our voyage, we've followed the Roman supply route from the mouth of the Wash, up the Witham, along the Fosdyke, the Roman canal, down the Trent and into the Ouse, the way the Romans carried the grain up to their northern garrisons. And we've carried our own symbolic cargo.
A single sack of English grain, the staple of the Roman diet. After a voyage of over 100 miles, there's an element of camaraderie from those who hail you on the final leg. There's a certain mood of merriment, too, from those who've travelled a great deal further. The L&W, with soya pellets from Rotterdam, discharging her cargo at Selby. Today, our guide from the port of Selby northwards is Brian Terry. We're on board the elegant Pippa's Song. Her polished brass and mahogany trim give her a somewhat recherché air on a working river like the Yorkshire Ouse.
Can you tell me the story of Pippa's Song? What is she?
She's a windmill launch. She was built, we believe, about 1924 at Bowness on Windermere, and was a typical day tripper. And her original name was the Fairy Queen. She was launched as the Fairy Queen, I think.
What made you change the name? Who's Pippa?
I didn't like the name Fairy Queen. So, Pippa's Song, I've always been fond of Browning, and hence the name really.
The years at the spring and days at the morn, mornings at 7, the hillsides dew-pearled, the larks on the wing, the snails on the thorn, God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. Robert Browning's best-known lines from Pippa Passes. After you've left the port of Selby, you're into a meandering loop of the river with not a dew-pearled hill in sight, and not a village, not a town. There's nothing until you get to Cawood. From Selby to Cawood, it's just 4 miles as the crow flies. Do the journey this way, add half of that again.
When you approach Cawood from the water, it looks a fairly 20th century place with its modern housing and its iron bridge. But there's a lot more to Cawood than meets the eye. We know from archaeological remains that this is where the Romans broke their journey to camp for the night or to wait for the tide.
By medieval times, Cawood was known for its tournaments. But apart from the bridge, most of the relics of the town's one-time importance have long since disappeared. All that remains of the castle, founded by King Athelstan in 930 AD, is the white stone gatehouse.
Later, this was Cardinal Wolsey's castle, and it's reported that Wolsey was lying here sick when arrested and charged with conspiracy and high treason. Apparently, Wolsey can't have been without friends. They say that there wasn't a dry eye in the village as the cardinal was led away. Now, Cawood Castle has a different identity. Officially, it's number 2.
Thorpe Lane.
In summer, this narrow width of tidal water looks easy enough to navigate, but unbelievably, the Ouse drains a total catchment area of 3,000 square miles, and in winter, it can be treacherous. The authorities talked about improvement to the river back in Wolsey's time. Not until 200 years later did they finally get round to it.
They actually opened the first lock in 1888, almost 100 years ago, and they chose the perfect cargo to christen it. At the time the lock was opened, the first vessel through was the Mary Rose. She was carrying 9 tons of wheat. At the time the lock was opened, that was the largest cargo of grain ever to travel the grain run to York.
There had been an earlier lock at Neyburn, but it wasn't large enough for even the smallest seagoing vessel, a fact that the authorities only later realised. The new lock, 150 feet long by 26 feet wide, was considered important enough to warrant a royal appointment. The lock that keeps the tides from York was first opened in Victoria's reign by one Prince Albert Victor. Neyburn Lock had the effect of raising the water level on the far side of the gates by 4 feet and 6 inches. Judging from the scene upriver, you'd think it happened yesterday. Apart from the occasional eyesore, the Ouse undergoes a dramatic change north of Neyburn. Now that the tide is left behind, the watercourse becomes a gracious stream, bordered by trees and parkland. Once we've left the tidal water, the elegant lines of Pippa's song take on a more fitting image as we approach the magnificence of Bishopthorpe Palace, home of His Grace, the Lord Archbishop of York, Primate of England. At one time, a curious custom was practiced at Bishopthorpe. Any vessel firing a salute as she passed the palace was gifted with a sack of ale. It's not known if the Mary Rose fired her greeting when she passed by with her tons of grain, and we didn't have the guns to try it. When we look at the present-day Bishopthorpe Palace, we also look into the past. After they knocked down Cawood Castle, the Roman grain run became the stone run, as they shipped the castle block by block and built it into the present palace. The ancient stone of Cawood Castle became the stone of Bishopthorpe. Because of 20th century improvements to the riverbank, it's difficult to conceive that this is the route pioneered by the Romans. These are the shores of the Roman grain run. But it wasn't just grain the Romans brought by water. In AD 71, Quintus Petilius Cerealis moved his troops from Lincoln, and some of them came by galley.
Cerealis was an astute military strategist, and when he brought the 9th Legion to York, he established it here at the junction of 2 rivers, the River Ouse and the River Foss. For centuries, this became the end of the Roman grain run. This is where they offloaded the grain, got it into the granaries, and it saw the Legion through the winter.
When Cerealis founded his new headquarters, he called it Eberacum, the place of the yew trees, and the history of York began. Now that history is preserved in the Castle Museum, where we too can offload our grain. There couldn't be a more fitting destination than the museum's Raindale Mill.
Oh, you brought the bag of wheat. Where have you bought it from?
All the way from the Fens, Ted.
Oh, that's good then.
From Lincolnshire.
That's good.
Can we have it in there?
Yeah, it's all right in there.
Good.
The Roman soldier was given his grain in the husk. He had to grind it for himself.
It's all right now.
There's plenty
Yeah,
there, isn't there?
oh, yes, it's nice. Nice stuff, that, isn't it?
It's good, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all right.
A voyage of over 100 miles, almost 2,000 years after the Romans, and history repeats itself.
We can only guess what kind of settlement existed here before Cerealis brought his 9th Legion, but the Roman pillar, unearthed during excavations in 1969, proves that the site of the Minster has always been the site of York's most important building. The Roman Principia, the headquarters, once stood here. And just around the corner, some 20 years ago, I lived in what used to be my Principia in an alleyway called Coffee Yard. The medieval figures on the ramparts of Witham Bar decorate the only gateway in the city of York which stands on the original Roman site. Of the earlier defences, only the multangular tower remains.
The Romans did a fine job. The fortress they built was built to last, and last it did. It stayed in their hands for almost 340 years. The multangular tower is the western extremity of Roman York. It's the oldest surviving part of the city.
It's in York that I hitch another lift, this time aboard a narrowboat, perhaps a strange sight on a river. But over the centuries, the wharves of York have seen all kinds of vessels, from billy boys to blobbers.
The Lady Galadriel might be a stranger on these waters, but she's something of a friend to me. It was the Lady Galadriel who carried me across the Pennines on a voyage between two seas, an earlier journey I made by water. Now, as the Ouse narrows, our craft narrows also, and the Lady Galadriel should see us safely through the shallow waters further to the north.
100 years ago, our skipper, Stuart Sampson, would have had to navigate along a river teeming with commercial traffic. But today, there's room to swing the proverbial battleship beneath Ouse Bridge and alongside the York waterfront, where the back of the riverside buildings is deemed as important as the facade, thanks in the main to tourism. Today, the most regular commercial traveller on the Ouse is the little shifter, who shifted past us somewhere between two bridges on the last leg of the grain run. Newsprint is the little shifter's cargo, newsprint bound for the riverside cellars of York and County Press. By the time that paper drops through the local letterboxes, it will have travelled over 1,000 miles by water from the forests of Scandinavia. In Roman times, most of the waterborne supplies would have stopped here in Iberacum, one of the major cities of the Roman Empire. Thanks to 18th century improvements to the river's navigation, we can voyage further to the north. Over 1,000 years after the Romans, Eberacum still benefits from the strategic planning of its founding fathers, bang in the middle of Britain. "200 miles to London, 200 north to Edinburgh." To venture northwards on the river is far more mysterious than rail or road. There are no stations to halt the progress or to tell you precisely where you are. Few signposts point the way ahead from one place to the other, or give the names of settlements where the chapels and the churches stand on the riverbank, half hidden in the trees. The navigator would have to have an eye for ecclesiastical architecture to know that the slender spire of All Saints' Church pinpoints the village of Newton on Ouse. On the upper reaches of the river, watermarks become more frequent than landmarks. Watermarks like the Linton Salmon Ladder, where Linton Lock is the only bypass to the thunder of the weir.
The River Ouse is an unusual river in that it has neither source nor mouth in the conventional sense. It ends at its confluence with the Trent, where it becomes the Humber, and it begins here in the middle of the country. From here on northwards, it becomes the Eure.
Without that unexpected signpost, it would be impossible to tell where the Ouse ends and the Eure begins. For the first few miles, one river is very little different from the other.
Just like her sister river, the Ouse, the Eure boasts her Roman connections. And this wharf here, beneath my feet, is indicative of the one-time importance of a village not half a mile away from the banks of the river. That village is Aldborough, or to give the place its Roman name, Isorium, Isorium Brigantum. So called because at the time of the Roman occupation, Isorium was the capital of the Brigant tribe, the largest tribe in northern England.
That stonework in the river can only be found in summer when the water's low. But not so very far away, there's even more ancient stonework that simply can't be missed. Set in the middle of next year's grain, the Bronze Age Devil's Arrows. Legend has it that these 30-ton monoliths are bolts which were shot by the devil to destroy the ancient cities of the north. The Romans established Isorium not as a city, but a civitas. an administrative capital from which to govern the Brigantes.
Isurium was a large settlement covering some 55 acres, but most of its archaeological remains now lie hidden beneath the present-day village. There is still evidence of the huge walls which surrounded the fortress, and in the Aldborough Museum there's evidence that the cargo on the grain run got here safely.
Unfortunately, the original wooden handles have gone from the Roman quernstone, making it tricky to grind the grain. But Aldborough's prized possession is the 8-pointed star of its tessellated pavement, a fine mosaic from a private house. It's likely that the majority of houses in Isurium Brigantum were private and very wealthy. The Civitas on the banks of the Ure became for a time the most northerly civil settlement in the whole of the Roman Empire. Further to the north, Roman scouts had reported wide rivers and vast swamps. The Roman response was to build a road. Now that's bypassed by our own A1. We've made a lot of changes since Roman times, not only in what we build, but in what we plan and what we plant. Fields of grain and great gardens.
When Major Edward Compton inherited Newby Hall in 1923, he found he had a beautiful house, but no garden. He called it, in his own words, a beautiful picture without a frame, and he spent the next 50 years putting it right. Newby Hall is still in the hands of the Compton family, but since the green-fingered Major's time, they've added a further gild to the frame.
When Robert Adam remodelled this magnificent Queen Anne mansion in the 1760s, he couldn't have foreseen the later magnificence of the 25-acre grounds or the increasing development in the river's mode of transport.
From here on northwards, the River Ure becomes unnavigable, and so we leave our last natural watercourse and head up the first man-made waterway since we left the Fosdyke over 100 miles behind us. This is the Ripon Canal.
It's just 2 miles and 2 furlongs from the River Ure to the town centre. Oxclose Lock would seem to qualify as a historic monument in its own right. The work was begun in the 1760s, about the time that Robert Adam was working on Newby Hall. We're not too far from the Roman connection. The word canal from the Latin canalis.
It was in 1906 that the carriers on the Ripon Canal first reported that their boats could no longer reach the canal basin. Then in the 1950s, the authorities cascaded the locks, turning them into waterfalls. Now, Ripon Marina is as far as you can get on any sizable craft.
Today, the bottom pound of the Ripon Canal is the home of the local boat club. The club barge, the Enid, is the last memorial to the days when grain was the major cargo.
Hello? Say again?
Welcome to Ripon.
Thank you very much. That's very nice to hear. Are you going to take a rope for us? Oh, lovely.
To complete the run to Ripon, you need to find a far more narrow craft. A narrow craft with a far more shallow draft.
It's 20 years since I was last in a canoe, and I can tell you the old habits do die. It isn't like riding a bicycle, and it isn't as easy as it ought to look. But still, it's good to get back to the old habits of man under his own power, man and muscle.
But there's no plain paddling up this cut. You have to have something fairly light in weight to carry your craft past the final lock where the voluntary navvies of the 1980s are digging out the refuse. They're restoring the whole of the Ripon Canal from the basin warehouse to the River Ure. When they get it finished, it's going to be a boater's paradise, to arrive by water in the gem of Ripon after almost 80 years. Today, the wharves of the Ripon Canal Basin are overshadowed by a builder's yard, but at least the basin's still in water, even though it's shallow.
I know the Romans never came this far by water. After all, the Ripon Canal didn't open until the 18th century. But there is a good reason for being here. It just happens that Ripon is as far north as you can travel on England's interconnected waterway network. Travel on a man-made navigation, and this is as far as man can get. It seemed the right place to end the grain run. Britain's ancient water highway, begun by the Romans and now run again, almost 2,000 years after them. Thanks for being my travelling companion.